Test, test, test. This is an interview with Governor Ernest Vandiver by Cliff Kuhn, Georgia Government Documentation Project, January 25th, 1994, tape 1. Yeah, I know that 1960 was a pretty busy year for you as governor, starting with the Sibley Commission and
it was indeed. It was probably the most hectic year in my life and in the history of Georgia, really.
I was saying to my student yesterday, from January of 60 to January 61 was a year that it was an incredible year for anybody from start to finish there. And you had gone through the Sibley Commission, and you had gone through the students trying to march on the Capitol in May, and then Democratic Convention.
The Ku Klux Klan was also trying to march on the Capitol at the same time, and so I kept both of them off the Capitol grounds because I was afraid that we would have a riot, and we were able to. Somebody stopped them. I didn't, except we had the state patrol there to keep them.
Chief Jenkins may have stopped them, actually.
He may have. I don't know who did.
But I was wondering, sort of before, to sort of set the stage, what you had learned from the Sibley Commission experience, which was different than your counterparts in other states.
Yes, Judge Sibley was one of the most respected lawyers and gentlemen who ever lived in Georgia. I knew that if a commission was appointed and didn't have the proper leadership, that it would be a fiasco. He was to go into each congressional district and hold hearings, and people were able to stand before their neighbors and express their views, some for closing the schools and some for not closing the schools. Judge Sibley made it quite plain that the options were either public schools or no schools under the Georgia law at that time. By the way, he and I were good friends. He was a segregationist himself. I would say that about 90% of the people of Georgia were at that time segregationist. Yeah. And but he was very impartial, and he gave everybody a hearing in each congressional district. The committee was split on their findings.
Right, I remember.
They did not all agree on what should be done, but I think he did yeoman service, really, to the people of Georgia by holding these hearings. And I had to beg him, really, to do it. He was 71 years old. He was ready to retire.
Right.
He didn't want to get involved in a political brouhaha. And so I told him, I said, Judge Sibley, if you don't do it, I can't let anybody else do it, because I know you will furnish the leadership that will keep it under control. And finally he agreed. And Griffin Bell, I think, talked to him at various times and helped get him to agree. I don't think I did it all by myself.
All right, it came from the same law firm.
But it came from the same law firm, and he had talked to Judge Sibley, and I went over and spent about an hour with him. And finally he agreed to do it. And so we went back and got the leadership of the House to introduce legislation creating a commission, which later became known as the Sibley Commission, and to hold hearings over the state.
It seemed to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that as I read about the Sibley Commission, there are a few things there that kind of inform what happens later on in the fall, and I'll bounce them off you and see what you think. One is that while you were involved, for various reasons, your name was not formally mentioned or publicly mentioned in regard to the Sibley Commission.
I preferred it that way. And if it had failed to pass, of course we'd had to take some other course. But the legislation was drawn up by our people and by our leadership. And I had told the leadership in the House and the Senate that unless they passed it and made Judge Sibley the chairman, that I would certainly oppose it.
Now, I understand, but maybe others don't understand what the thinking was to distance yourself publicly from or to not identify.
I wanted it to be an impartial hearing. I wanted everybody to have a chance to express themselves. I didn't want it to be a Vandiver commission. I wanted it to be a legislative commission which represented the whole state. And that was the reason that I didn't want it to be a Vandiver commission.
It was also fairly, I mean, very sensitive.
Oh, it's very
politically, too.
controversial, no question about that.
And the other thing that struck me when I read through that is that, you know, you did have a desire to stay within the letter of the law. You know, that
I did.
you know, that there wasn't a defiance of the law, and there's sort of a recognition that even if you didn't like it, this is the way that the law was.
Right. Well, Georgia laws were very clear at that time. You'd had Senator Talmadge, when he was governor, who had proposed and had the legislature enact many laws,
Sure.
and then Governor Griffin followed him up with a great number of laws regarding segregation. And when I took my oath, I swore that I would uphold the laws and Constitution of the state of Georgia, and that was my position at that time.
I meant also, though, even though you didn't like the decisions of the federal courts after Little Rock and so forth,
No, I did not. In fact, I supported President Kennedy. We were senator when I talked
Right,
with
sure.
him. I went to Washington with James Gray, who was the national
Democratic.
head of the party, and Robert Russell, who was my brother-in-law, who was also national committeeman. And we sat down with Senator Kennedy then and Senator Johnson. I believe there was another senator from Florida. Smathers was there. And I, instead of talking before the whole group, I asked Senator Kennedy at that time if I could have a private conversation with him. And I told him in the private conversation that we wanted to support him, but at the same time, I did not want Georgia to be embroiled in what had happened in Arkansas, that we would handle our problems ourselves. The state would handle them. We didn't want the court to handle them, and that we would do our best to handle them ourselves. And he promised me that he would never send federal troops into the state of Georgia, nor would he federalize the National Guard, which is what happened in Arkansas.
So I don't think people realize how big that shadow of Little Rock was sort of.
Oh, it was tremendous at that time. It was. It had people's emotions. I've never seen emotions so evident as they were at that time. I remember Georgia Tech was playing Arkansas in the Gator Bowl, and Governor Faubus came, and I was there, sort of as the host. And we went down on the field and made a statement. You could the applause that Faubus got on that occasion was I don't know how you could describe it, but he was a hero of the whole South, and what few little words I had to say didn't bring much applause, because I wasn't going to make any statements at that time. I didn't know what the situation was.
Right, but you didn't want to have that kind of federal-state confrontation.
I did not. And he promised me, President Kennedy promised me, that he would never send troops into Georgia, nor would he federalize the National Guard.
And this was obviously between the convention and the election, somewhere in there.
Yes, it was. We went. Senator Johnson was majority leader at that time, and vice president-elect, and he had a fabulous office up there, and so we went to his office, and that's where we had our conference. They wanted me to announce my support for Kennedy after I told him if he would agree to that I would support him in every way that I could. They wanted me to announce my support there, and I said, no, I can't do that. I've got to go back home and do that before the people of Georgia. I don't want them to think I came up to Washington and got talked into something. So I had several days to between the time I told him that I would support him and the time that I announced my support. In fact, he and President Johnson called me the day that I made the announcement and asked me if I was in the bomb shelter. I said, no, I think we survived somewhere.
Right. that the purpose of that trip was to precisely to get this kind of information and
Yes,
appearances,
I wanted to have assurance from him that we wouldn't have a situation in Georgia the way that Arkansas had to confront federal troops and the National Guard. National Guard firing on their neighbor, that was just unheard of. You couldn't have had a situation like that.
And you had experience with the Guard here too, personally?
Yes, I had spent 6 years with the National Guard as Chief of Staff and Adjutant General, and I knew every guardsman in Georgia practically, and I certainly did not want them involved in a situation where there was a riot.
And someone could get killed.
Right.
So it was you and your brother-in-law, Bob Russell,
That's right.
and Gray from
James
Albany,
Gray, right.
Who went up there, and you spoke with Johnson and Kennedy.
Right.
And was Bobby at all involved in
Bobby
this?
was not there.
Had you ever met Bobby?
Oh yes, I had met Bobby. I met Bobby out at Los Angeles
At the convention.
after President Kennedy was nominated by the party, and I had met him on 2 or 3 occasions. And between that time and the election, he came to Georgia and spent some time.
Well, that's what I wanted to know, because I thought that somewhere I saw a reference that Bobby may have known some of the people, or met at least some of the people who then, George Stewart, for instance, and others that.
I'm not sure whether he met George Stewart
Okay.
or not. George was at that time treasurer or secretary of the Democratic Party. He was also secretary of the Senate,
Right.
State Senate, and he may, in the course of the reception that was given for Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, he may have met him, but I don't think he would have been able to pick him out.
Okay. Do you remember what Robert Kennedy's activities were when he came to check on the campaign here?
He came sort of to find out what was going on in Georgia and what was happening. One of the people that I had appointed to the Board of Regents, Roy Harris,
Sure.
he was strenuously opposed to Kennedy, and they when they were not sure who was going to be nominated for vice president, they were trying to get me to put my name in, let them put my name in as a candidate for vice president, just as a symbol of defiance. And I, of course, when Johnson was nominated, I said no, because we had supported Johnson.
Right. And he had Georgia ties.
And he had Georgia ties. His grandfather was sheriff of a county.
Henry County.
Henry County.
Okay. Then the other thing, I mean, I noticed earlier in 1960, Martin Luther King comes back to Georgia, meets a fair amount of ballyhoo, and you issue a statement at that time.
Yes, I didn't want him stirring up the people of Georgia like he had done in Alabama, and we kept a very close watch on him.
Meaning what?
Meaning that we watched his activities. We didn't want a riot to occur, and it seemed to follow him. He was supposed to be a man who was opposed to any violence, and but it seemed to follow him wherever he
That's
went.
what your statement was in early in 1960. Had you been aware of his traffic arrest beforehand? You know, the one out.
Oh yes, it was in the paper. Everybody knew about it.
Then, of course, a few weeks before the election, everything begins to go fast.
Yes, at jail we had a meeting of all the southern governors in Atlanta. We had the Governor Ellington of Tennessee, Luther Hodges of North Carolina, Fritz Hollins of South Carolina, Ferris Bryant of Florida. I don't think Patterson made that meeting. He was governor of Alabama at that time. But we presented a fairly united front in support of President Kennedy. We carried it by, Georgia went for Kennedy by a large.
Well, I'm aware of that, yeah. But then a few weeks before the election, I guess in mid-October, the arrest at Riches takes place. And then, you have this week of very active active activity. I'd be curious to know sort of how the governor's office, you personally monitored that situation as it was unfolding before King got transferred to DeKalb County, before he got sent to Reidsville and then released.
Well, of course, there was a lot of activity. Lunch Canada activity in North Carolina, spread to Georgia. We were watching it very carefully, hoping that it wouldn't affect the election. But we had gone all out in support of it, done everything.
Were you actually thinking in those terms there might be some connection between the incident and the outcome of the race?
Well, a little spark could have ignited the situation at that time, and we could have had a real riot. If somebody made a false statement, made a statement that was inflammatory, it could have brought half of South Georgia to Atlanta. And a lot of the Ku Klux Klan, they were very active, and I was trying to steer a middle course. I didn't want them to have any control, nor did I want the black people to start a riot. So that was the reason I kept them both off the Capitol grounds at that time, because it could have developed in.
They did here in the spring, and they resume in the fall. And the first time that King actually joins the students and sits in at the lunch counter at Rich's. There are these negotiations that are in the city of Atlanta with Mayor Hartsfield and Dick Rich and, you know, the prosecutor, the solicitor in Fulton County and so forth. What role, if anything, or what input did the governor's office have in any of that?
Well, Hartsfield was a supporter of mine, and had been very active in supporting me, which was a little bit unusual in those times. No governor had been elected in the last 25, 30 years with the support of the mayor of Atlanta.
But in contrast to Bodenhammer, you know, it seemed...
Well, they had, maybe they chose me as the lesser of the evils, I guess. But we were able to communicate. There wasn't any great wall between us. I wanted to move at my pace, and they wanted to move faster than I wanted to move. I felt like that really, that all of this would have developed and would have evolved without any of this school business happening if they just left us alone. Not as quickly, but we had almost a generation of children who lost a great deal of their education because of the tension and I think it set us back, education, in the field of education.
Although you had the Atlanta suit and then you had the court order of Judge Hooper, so there wasn't too much you could...
Yes, Judge Hooper was a very good friend of mine and my wife's family. I knew him very well. He was kind enough, and I told him this before he died, to give us this time to try to educate the people as to what the options were. He gave us a year, and that was when we created the Sibley Commission, and we let the people know exactly what their options were, either no schools or integrated schools.
One thing that just occurred to me, sort of a little bit off the subject, but I noticed in the confirmation hearings of Attorney General Pell when he and then also in the interview I did with him, that he mentioned that he actually had met, while he was her chief of staff, with older representatives, leaders of the black community, kind of with Warren Cochran and some of the more conservative, older black community leaders.
I had met with them too. Senator Talmadge at that time was in the Senate.
Right.
And he called me and asked me to come to Lovejoy. And when I walked in the room, I didn't know why. He said it was an important meeting. When I walked into the room at Senator Talmadge's home, there was a group of black leaders in there. And by the way, this has never been divulged.
Yeah, well, it's new to me.
But Senator Talmadge will confirm it. Warren Cochran was among them, and all of the black leadership was there. And they wanted to try to persuade me to let this thing happen. Of course, I couldn't. The governor's hands were tied by the laws of Georgia, and I couldn't make them any promises, and did not. Although most of the blacks were supporters of mine. Again, there's the lesser of the evils problem.
What did you think when you went into the
I was surprised. Frankly, I was very surprised. But they were there, and we had a very pleasant discussion. There were no arguments, anything. I knew what their problem was. They knew what my problem was. And I didn't know that Judge Bell had met with them until the hearings. But I knew that I had met with him, and Senator Talmadge had met with him after I had been elected governor, before I was inaugurated.
Well, that's interesting. That's a side of Herman that people haven't heard, too, from that dating from that
I might want to talk with him about that, because I'd never divulged it, or I guess he did.
So, this was actually, you were called to him, when you were in the governor's office, you were called
No,
to
this was prior to the time that I was inaugurated.
Okay, so... I see. After being elected.
After I was elected, he asked me to come to Lovejoy for a meeting. And really, I didn't know what the meeting was about, except that he said it was very important.
Kind of a realization that being governor then was going to be different than what being governor had been under Marvin, or
that's right, and under Senator Talmadge.
And under Senator Talmadge, that it was the new.
He was aware of the situation. He knew that things were changing and had to change. And he had very strong ties with the black community, and they always supported him, as far as I know, except maybe the last election, where Mattingly, they figured that probably Mattingly was the lesser of the evils, but of course Talmadge had a lot of baggage that he had to carry. He'd had a divorce, and he'd had some difficulties.
Problems, sure. Okay, well, the students are arrested, and King is arrested, and there's this original flurry of phone calls where Harris Wofford in the Kennedy campaign is now the senator from Pennsylvania. And
I never heard of Harris Wofford until after he was elected to the Senate.
Well, at any rate, Hartsfield makes a statement based on questionable evidence that Senator Kennedy is interested in the matter. Do you recall any of that?
After the thing occurred, there were a lot of people who decided that they would like to get involved.
Right.
One was Robert Trotman, who had been a very close friend of Kennedy's. I knew that.
College, hadn't he?
He went to Harvard and roomed with Joe Kennedy.
Right. And
anyway,
played a role at the convention too, as I recall.
He did. He was a very active supporter of the Kennedys during the campaign and at the convention.
So then,
a lot of people got involved after the thing developed like it did, because this was a very short time before the national election.
All right. Now, what is Robert Troutman? What?
He was not involved in this at all.
Okay.
In fact, I didn't know that Robert had any part of this until after the thing occurred, and then he said he had some part in it.
Well, again, Mayor Hartsfield, though, makes some, it's hard to follow the chronology, but Mayor Hartsfield also trying to get involved early on, while King is still in Fulton County in Atlanta, makes a statement without clearing it with the candidate himself that Senator Kennedy is interested in this case. And I saw then a statement, I thought from your office, saying that
Mayor Hartsfield nor Robert Troutman had any route by which they could have gone to Judge Oscar Mitchell.
Right. Right.
There was no way they could influence him. They were completely opposite.
Different worlds, different universes.
Absolutely different.
DeKalb County versus Fulton County.
Right.
I mean, even before Judge Mitchell said that King would not be let out of jail and would have to go to DeKalb County on the driver's license charge. I saw something where Griffin Bell releases a statement that states that Kennedy would never involve himself with the affairs of a sovereign state. You know.
Maybe he made that statement after I told him about what our conversation was in Washington. I don't know why.
Yeah. Okay. Just trying
You'd
to.
have to ask him about that.
Right. I'm just trying to. At what point did you know?
He was the northern campaign manager of North Georgia.
Right.
George L. Smith.
George L. was in South
Georgia.
Right.
Yeah.
At what point did you know that Judge Mitchell was going to revoke King's probation and keep him in jail in DeKalb and then in Reidsville?
I didn't know it until after he did it. What happened was the State Patrol monitored all calls that came into the executive mansion and would not wake me up until 7 o'clock. That's usually the time I got up. But about 6:30 in the morning, a call came through, and he had, Senator Kennedy had told them that he needed to talk with me, Senator Kennedy at that time. And so they put him through, and I was asleep. Betty and I were both asleep. And so they put the call through, and he said that he was going to be busy that day, but was there anything that I could possibly do to help get Martin Luther King out of jail? I said, Senator, I don't know. I said, it'd be political suicide for me to do it overtly, and I don't know whether I can or not. I couldn't make any promises. And he said, well, I'm going to be busy today, but here's a number where you can reach Bobby. And he gave me the number. And he said, if you are successful, call Bobby and let him know. And so we left it at that. Hung up.
See, let's go over the whole conversation then.
Right.
You know, he says, he calls up, you answer the phone, and it is Senator Kennedy, and he said, I want to talk to you. You know, can you reconstruct that, the entire conversation as
Well, he just said that it's important to me if Martin Luther King is freed. It's important to me politically. He said, is there anything that you can do? And I said, well, Senator, I don't know that I can do anything. I couldn't make any promises. I don't know what I could do. And I said it would be political suicide for me to be openly involved in trying to get him to do it. I plan to run for governor again, and maybe the Senate when Senator Russell or Senator Talmadge left the Senate. So I had what I thought then was a political future. And so I was not going to alienate about 80% of the people in South Georgia, at least, by doing anything openly. But I said, I'll do what I can undercover, and we'll see what we can do. And he said, if you can do anything, I won't be available. I'm busy. I'm speaking. But call Bobby at this number. And so we proceeded then to do.
Go finish the sentence, and I think we have enough. You proceeded then to do.
I proceeded to call Bob Russell, who was my brother-in-law and was National Committeeman of Georgia at that time.
Hold on. It's still early in the morning. This is sort of right after
Yes,
Senator Kennedy calls.
Yes, this was early in the morning.
And what was the conversation with you and Bob Russell?
I told him about the call from Senator Kennedy, and he realized that it was a tough call, and it was going to be difficult to do. And so we discussed it, and the only person that we knew that was close enough to Judge Mitchell to talk with him was one of his schoolmates, classmates, and that was George Stewart, who was also Secretary of the Party and was Secretary of the Senate at that time. And so we decided to call George. George came out to the executive mansion, and we told him what the situation was.
This the same day?
This was the same day.
Same day.
Yes, it was that same morning. And that Senator Kennedy felt like it was important to his election that Martin Luther King be released, and we were supporting Kennedy.
What was George Stewart's reaction to all this? I mean, he was wearing several hats himself. He had been involved with the States' Rights Council.
Oh,
strong segregationist.
He was Herman Talmadge's roommate at the University of Georgia, so anything that Herman had done, George Stewart was 100% back up. He was 100% back of me. And he'd been my friend. I'd been lieutenant governor for 4 years, and he was secretary of the Senate.
Sure, you knew.
So we were very close. I could talk to George about anything. And so we called him out to the mansion and asked him if he thought he could do anything with Oscar Mitchell, who had stated that he was not going to let Martin Luther King out of jail. He said, I don't know whether I can or not. I'll try.
Judge Mitchell was pretty direct, kind of.
He was. He was a tough judge. And George didn't know whether he could talk to him or not.
Now, did Judge Mitchell act entirely on his own, as far as you know, in terms of the actions that he took, to keep Martin Luther King in jail?
Up until this time,
Up until this time, okay.
Yes, and he stated he was going to keep him in jail.
Okay.
And but George said that he would go and talk with him and report back to Bobby Russell and to me the result of the conversation. And I said, well, that's all we can do. That's the only thing we can do. And so he left the mansion immediately and went to Decatur and got with Judge Mitchell. And I don't know what he told Judge Mitchell. From events that unfolded later, he might have told him that he might have a chance to be a federal judge if this thing was worked out. I don't know that.
Why do you presume that?
Well, I did know that George Stewart and Judge Mitchell went to Washington and had a conversation with Bobby after the election. So that made me feel like that maybe he might have said that. I don't know whether he said it or not. He didn't tell me that. But he did tell me that Judge Mitchell would release Martin Luther King if he could get a call from President Kennedy or from Bobby Kennedy.
Okay. Do you know if there's a legal question about whether you could revoke bail on a misdemeanor pending appeal?
It was a question, of course.
And
But that would have taken a long time to decide.
Who recognized the legal issue concerning the appropriateness of Judge Mitchell's action in revoking bail on a misdemeanor pending appeal?
Well, the legal question was not really involved at that time. He had Martin Luther King in jail, and he had the power to release him on his own recognizance. So that was not discussed, the legal situation. Well, it was about a week before the election. Martin Luther King Sr. was supporting Nixon at that time. And a great number of the black people were supporting Nixon.
Because of John Calhoun in Atlanta.
Yeah. And so George Stewart called me back and told me that Oscar had agreed to release him if he got a call from either President Kennedy or Bobby Kennedy.
Now, was this, again, the chronology is unclear. Was this after King had actually been sent to Reidsville? Or was he still in the DeKalb?
No, he was still in the DeKalb.
It was before he got sent to Reidsville?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he was still in the...
he was still in DeKalb, in the Decatur Courthouse,
yeah.
Or whatever it was. So, George Stewart calls you back and says that Judge Mitchell has agreed if...
he got a call from Bobby Kennedy or President Kennedy.
Okay. This is a question. The call that you got from Senator Kennedy implies that he and Bobby were in communication.
Well, they were working together, there's no question about it. You said call Bobby, he'll be at this number, and you call him if you're successful. And he did.
Okay, and what did, and so George Stewart seemed to say, well, I think it's going to work with Judge Mitchell.
Yeah, so he needed a call.
Okay, so then how do you let the Kennedys know, or who calls whom to let them know what's happening?
I called Bobby Kennedy at the number that President Kennedy had given me.
Okay.
And told him that I thought if he called Judge Mitchell that he might be successful in getting Martin Luther King released.
Or what did Bobby, what can you recall that conversation?
It was not a long conversation. It was President Kennedy and Bobby had discussed this situation. It was at that time it was headlines all over the United States, and he felt like it would make a tremendous impact on his election if he could have some part in helping to get King out of jail.
So from your perspective, it's actually the candidate himself who realizes the possibilities here.
Oh yeah,
You know,
no question about it.
So Bobby was almost kind of waiting for your call, and
Oh yeah, he was expecting me to call, and if you'll read his biography, maybe it was an autobiography that he wrote. I've forgotten whether
biographies.
They recorded him anyway. That I called him and told him to call Judge Mitchell.
Now,
and that I wanted to stay out of it because I didn't want to be involved in it. He knew that. I said it would affect my political future if I get involved in it. And please don't involve me in it. And he did not, except until he wrote his biography.
well, he mentioned it. He got interviewed for the Kennedy Library, and he mentioned it in passing in 1964, and they kind of got off the subject and got to something else.
I wish they discussed it a little more thoroughly.
Yeah, I do too, because Bobby's gone. Now, so his call then to Judge Mitchell occurs shortly thereafter?
It was in the afternoon.
Now, from Bobby's perspective, it's the thing that he projected is that he got mad at Judge Mitchell and decided to call him on the spur of the moment. And Bobby's the one who gets a lot of credit from this, from this whole episode. And that's how people, I think, remember it. Bobby Kennedy made the phone call from the phone booth. And
Bobby could not have discussed this on an amicable basis with Mitchell unless there had been some groundwork laid. It would have been ridiculous.
Explain why. I agree with you, but explain why.
Well, they were two absolutely different people politically. Judge Mitchell was an ardent segregationist, and he knew that the Kennedy people were liberal. And he just could not have picked up the phone and called Judge Mitchell, and that resulted in releasing Martin Luther King. There wasn't any way he could have done it. It had to be done another way. But Judge Mitchell was expecting a call from Kennedy, and he'd already decided that he was going to release it. If they called, and he did.
Now, somewhere in there, I saw, there's reference to other phone calls that went back and forth between George and wherever the Kennedys were during a time asking them not to put out a strong statement concerning King, a strong, asking the Kennedy forces not to put out a strong public statement, supporting King, but that you would, work to get him out.
Get him out. Well, of course, you may remember that Richard Nixon had sent Mrs. King a telegram expressing his sympathy. President Kennedy was able to call her and tell her
Right.
that he was happy that Martin Luther King had been released, and I'm sure that he told her that that he was involved in it some way.
I was wondering if in your
I don't know what he told her, but she thought he had some involvement in the release. I was not mentioned because I did not want to be tied in with this thing. I was 43 or 4 years old. I thought I could be governor again or go to the Senate.
And I mean, did you actually say that in so many words to Bobby or to Judge Mitchell?
No, I said to Bobby that I could not be involved in this thing personally because they'd run me out of Georgia. I think were the words I probably used because of my politics.
Of course, Bobby's a good politician, and
he understood it. He knew exactly what the situation was. In fact, he'd been to Atlanta, and he'd come out to the mansion after the reception. He and Miss Kennedy, and my children were small at that time, and he had some children about the same age. And I got my children up out of bed and introduced them to him, and
I was wondering whether there was any other parts of an agreement between here and Washington, or wherever they were. In other words, I saw some reference, and I just wanted to clear it. If they didn't interfere with a strong public statement, you would get King out, or what?
Well, I didn't want them to give me any credit for it.
Right, behind the scenes, right?
Yeah. No, not at that time.
Did you ask them not to make any kind
I explained to Bobby what my situation was.
Right. I meant, did you ask them not to make any statement, sort of pro-King kind of statements?
Well, I don't recall that I asked him not to make that kind of statement. He knew, he was a realist. He knew what my situation was. But I reiterated to him that to leave me out of this thing, because I had some politics that I wanted to be involved in the future.
Now, I think you said that when you got this call from Senator Kennedy, the call at 6:30 in the morning, King was still in DeKalb County, had not been sent down to Reidsville yet.
As I understand it, that was the way it was.
Then how did he manage to, even as these things were going, how did he get sent to Reidsville?
I was under the impression he was in jail in DeKalb County.
Okay. Well, he was first in DeKalb County, and then he briefly got sent to Reidsville, and after a number of hours got released, sent back.
I didn't know that he'd been sent to Reidsville.
So you had
until I later read about it.
Okay, you had nothing to do, or no one.
No.
That was sort of all independent.
Yeah, I had nothing to do with that.
Now, did you and who else was sort of on to what was going on?
There were only three of us. It was George Stewart, my wife knew it, of course. George Stewart and Bobby Russell and me were the only ones in any official position that knew about it.
And Griffin Bell did not?
Griffin didn't know about it.
And George L?
George L didn't know about it. No, but none of them did.
Obviously, you were in the position, it was the governor's call to, you had the connection that could get to Oscar Mitchell. And
George Stewart and Oscar were the closest of friends, and that was the reason we called George and asked him to make that visit to Judge Mitchell.
Now, I noticed Charlie Pooh with the Atlanta Journal had a story about a month after the election. Well, right at the election, Eisenhower says 2 phone calls, made the difference. The New York Times has Eisenhower saying that it's these 2 little phone calls that made the difference, referring to Jack's call to Coretta and Robert Kennedy's call to Judge Mitchell. And then,
President Kennedy later told me it made the difference.
When you went up to Washington later on.
Yeah, went to the inauguration. And then I saw him on 2 or 3 other occasions.
Well, yeah, it's sort of widely acclaimed as having made the difference. Charlie Pugh in the Atlanta Journal in December of 1960. I can show you the article.
I don't remember the article.
Well, it's the article that says King Call arranger was George Stewart. Party secretary advised Mitchell to hint of Kennedy telephoning. Because Judge Mitchell also, when he released Martin Luther King, hinted that a brother of a candidate had been involved, that he had been in contact. So where did that idea come from? That when Oscar Mitchell releases King, he hints that a brother of a candidate had been in contact with him. Do you know how that came about?
Charlie Pugh was a very close friend of mine. He was a member of the press, and I might have discussed it with Charlie after the fact. Back in those days, you could talk to the press off the record, and without being quoted. You can't do that today. But Charlie was a close friend of mine, and I might have discussed it with Charlie.
I hope to talk with him. I wrote him a letter. He wrote me back, and it wasn't quite clear sort of how well his mind is working right now. I don't know. Do you keep up with him, or?
He came to my 70th birthday. We had a party over here, and we invited all the political writers who were there at that time, and all of my office staff came over, and we celebrated my 70th birthday, and that's the last time I saw Charlie. Okay. And Charlie had off the record, had a drinking problem. Okay. And I know we invited he and his wife wouldn't come with him, so she knew that we were probably going to serve some drinks.
Okay, that would be awesome.
And that's off the record.
Okay.
But I might have talked to Charlie off the record. I don't recall that.
It's interesting.
But it sounds like I did.
It says, and this is December 23rd, 1960. It says, and it's a copyrighted article. George D. Stewart, Secretary of the Democratic Party, was the behind-the-scenes manipulator who parlayed the release from jail of the Reverend Martin Luther King possibly into the election of Jack Kennedy. It was Stewart, a veteran of rough-and-tumble Georgia politics, who advised DeKalb Criminal Court Judge Oscar Mitchell, a longtime friend, to hint to reporters that Bobby Kennedy had sought the release of King and Nixon, in effect, had not.
That's exactly what happened. I might have talked to Charlie about that off the record, but he didn't quote me.
No, that's the next point I was going to say, that in this article, you're not mentioned at all. And then I noticed Charlie Pugh did a profile of you as you were leaving office in Atlanta Magazine, and of the Vandiver years and so forth. And again, he mentions the Sibley Commission in the University of Georgia, but he doesn't mention this episode at all.
It was off the record.
And where there is stuff pointing to this, it points to Stewart as the go-between.
No question about it.
Without ever...
Well, Hartsfield had no way to contact Mitchell.
Judge Mitchell.
Bobby Troutman had no way that he could have gotten to Judge Mitchell and talked to him.
None of the other lawyers. Now, one person I have talked to is James Mackey from Decatur.
I know Tim.
Yeah, I know.
He's a friend of mine. He and I were sworn in to practice law on the same day before the Supreme Court.
That's right.
He was a very liberal person, but we were always friends.
Well, Mackey had actually once shared offices with Judge Mitchell, and
I didn't realize.
A long time, way back, they had shared a secretary or something like that, before Oscar was on the bench. And Mackey told me that he went to, independently on his own, he went to Judge Mitchell and said, "You can't do this. You can't deny a man bail on a misdemeanor pending appeal." And Judge Mitchell said, "I'm committed to it. I'm going to do it. This is what I'm going to do." So it had to take some considerable influence to get Judge Mitchell to change his mind and change his decision on that.
George Stewart is the man that did it at our request.
I noticed at the time of George's funeral, 1977, some years later, the obituaries hint that he, got to, he's best known for talking to Judge Mitchell, to release King and to hint that a brother of Senator Kennedy had contacted him. It had to be Robert Kennedy.
Yes, it was Robert.
Ted was too young, and
Yeah. Yeah, I met Ted at the convention. He was about 26, 7 years old. He was just a kid.
Right. So is this story known in state political circles? I mean, who knows?
I never discussed it until after I knew that my political career was over.
When and under what circumstances did you begin to discuss it?
I ran for the Senate in 1972.
Yeah.
And Sam Nunn and I, Carter had appointed Gambrell.
David Gambrell. Right.
After he had told me, sitting right in this room, that he was going to appoint me.
I've heard that.
And then I told Carter I was going to run against Gambrell and going to do my best to beat him. And then Sam Nunn jumped into the race. And Sam had been in the legislature a couple of times. He hadn't really had much experience. But I had Jimmy Carter, who had appointed Gambrell, fighting me as governor. I had Marvin Griffin fighting me. I had Lester Maddox fighting me. I had all the political powers at that time fighting me except Herman Talmadge. And Herman made the statement that he was not going to take any sides in it until the nominee was selected. Right. And so Sam and I got together and discussed this, that if he came in second to Gambrell, because Gambrell was the incumbent, had the great advantage. Right. If he came in second, that I would support him. If I came in second and it was run off, he would support
half
me.
A percentage point.
About a half a percentage point difference. And I did. I wrote about 20,000 letters for Sam to people that I had known throughout the state and helped him in his election.
How does this relate back to what we're talking about?
Really, it doesn't. That doesn't relate back to anything that we're talking about.
Except you're saying that you still have political.
I still had political ambition, of course.
Through 72.
Yes. After that, I knew there wasn't any possibility for me to ever be elected governor again or to the Senate.
And it was only at that time that you began to.
Then I talked about it.
So as late as 72, you felt it still might be a political hot potato.
Would have been. If that had been in the public domain in 42.
72.
In 72, I don't think I would have gotten half as many votes as I did. I got about 20.5%, and Sam got a few more, about a 0.5% more.
What's interesting to me is that, there are some times, this Charlie Pugh article, for instance, and then at the occasion of George Stewart's funeral, it was mentioned in the obituaries that he had some behind the scenes.
Oh, he did.
What's interesting to me is that very few of the historians, the people who've written about this episode, have picked up on this connection, and I was curious to know what you think about that.
A lot of people who, after the fact, want to take credit for it. I did not want to take credit for it at that time, and never did until I realized that my political career was over. And Hartsfield, he felt like he'd made the difference. Bobby Troutman thought he'd made the difference. A lot of people.
As I think I told
Success
you.
has many fathers, and failure is an orphan.
Morris Abram, I told you, who was close to Hartsfield in the negotiations downtown, thought that he...
Yeah, Morris was a friend of mine, but he was completely on the other side of the political fence.
Right. Now, I'll tell you a funny one. Thurgood Marshall told Donald Hollowell, the attorney, that everybody's claiming credit to get King out except for the lawyers, and he was sort of impatient with Hollowell, and he's quoted somewhere saying, well, Hollowell, everyone else is claiming credit for it except for the lawyers. What are the lawyers doing here? So it's a story that, and Harris Wofford, who's now senator from Pennsylvania.
Yes, there was an article in the Reader Digest in which Wofford was claiming credit for this, and didn't mention any of the things that really happened. And I wrote to the Reader's Digest, wrote him a letter, and told him exactly what happened. There's, what's the man's name from Georgia who is
Reader's Digest.
the editor?
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Anyway, I wrote him and told him exactly what happened, that this was not the way it was. And evidently the letter never got to the person that I wrote it to. I got a reply from somebody else, which I can show you the letter.
Yeah, I'd like to see that actually, when that was and what you said, and
I think it'd be in my files. I think we've got a copy of it.
Did George Stewart, to your knowledge, talk about it? Because I guess
I don't think George ever talked about it. If he did, I don't know about it. He wouldn't have mentioned me. Because he was my friend too. He wasn't.
Right. And the same, of course, with your brother-in-law.
Right.
Let me just change the tape.
My association with George Stewart was, well, from the very beginning. He was a roommate, a very close friend of Herman Talmadge.
Who? George was a roommate of a friend of. He was a roommate of.
He was at the University of Georgia at the same time Herman Talmadge was, and was a friend of him at the university. They remained friends, and George was a long-time supporter of Herman Talmadge.
Right.
And because I was in the loop among the Talmadge groups, we
Sure.
became close friends. And then when I was elected lieutenant governor, we asked him to continue to serve as, I'm not sure whether he was serving before I was elected, or whether we asked him to serve for the first time. But anyway, he was Secretary of the Senate while I was governor, lieutenant governor.
Right, sure.
And I know, and if you've researched the files, you'll find that George was arrested. He was drunk, and his car was parked on the side of the road, and he was arrested. And it was very embarrassing to George. I remember I told George, I said, well, our friendship goes way beyond that, George. And
Sure.
we had a joint session of the General Assembly, and it was the duty of the Secretary of the Senate to escort the Lieutenant Governor. And so George and I walked down the aisles for a joint session a day or two after he had that unfortunate event with the law. George had a terrible drinking problem too. It really killed him. He drank too much.
I was curious, did Bobby have any communication with George during this time? Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy?
I don't think so. Not during that time, but I did hear, now this is hearsay,
Okay.
that George and Oscar went to Washington and had an appointment with Bobby. You can check that.
Well, I know
records, maybe.
Oscar went to Washington.
Didn't George go?
Well, I'm not sure. That that could be. I know
so.
that.
I heard that.
Now, Judge Mitchell, I know is still alive, if I'm not mistaken, right?
I don't think he's dead.
But he's never really talked very much about this. Is there any way that you could think of that? I mean, I can just call.
I'm not close enough to him to call him and ask him to do it.
Right.
Maybe somebody could.
Can you think of anybody who might be? Because obviously.
Maybe Jim Mackey could.
Well, Mackey, I could certainly give him a call and see if he would do that.
But he will, if he will talk about it, he'll tell you that this is exactly the way it happened.
Well, there's one article I found in 1978 Atlanta Journal that's about Judge Mitchell, sort of a profile, and it emphasizes Kennedy's phone call, Robert Kennedy's phone call. It says, a week before the election, Robert Kennedy called Mitchell personally to intervene on King's behalf. John Kennedy called Mrs. King to express his concern. Mitchell finally freed King on bond, pending appeal of his case. The resulting publicity is credited with swinging black votes.
No question about it. I think those the votes because of President Kennedy's phone call, and I think he must have intimated to her that he had some influence over getting him out of jail. I don't know what he said to her, but
well,
anyway.
I think this is Theodore White, who in this article is quoted as saying, a good argument can be made for the proposition that Judge Oscar Mitchell of the DeKalb County Civil and Criminal Court elected John F. Kennedy as the next president.
Theodore White came and interviewed me for about half a day, off the record. President Kennedy had told him about this whole thing, and he came and spent a whole afternoon with me.
And did you ever read his book, or have you read any?
I didn't ever read his book.
Or any of the other accounts of the
Making
story?
of the President, I read parts of it. I didn't read the whole thing.
Well, you must have read the section about these phone calls, or
yeah.
And do you recall what you thought about?
But I talked with Theodore White. And for the whole afternoon, and this was off the record too. I asked him, please keep it off the record, because he knew about it. He knew it when he came. He knew about it.
Okay, so
he came to confirm it, I think.
And he's also then kind of protecting your political career.
He was. He understood my situation.
Because I think today people might not understand kind of the tightrope that you, as governor in a deep South state in 1960, had to walk, in a situation like this.
Oh, he was.
And maybe you could sort of talk about the dilemmas that you had, sort of, having said no, not one, having to comply with the federal court orders, having to deal with not only the school situation, but the sit-ins and, the specter of Martin Luther King, seeking political office, dealing with the Kennedys. I mean, it's a extremely
tough. It
tough.
was a difficult time to be governor. Most governors enjoy their term. I was under pressure from the time I took the oath until I left office.
So,
tremendous pressure.
What if any?
Not only did they have this happen, the county unit system was abolished, and Morris Abram filed suit in that. And so we had to deal with that one too.
When I teach my Georgia history classes, I say in 1958, when Vandiver was elected, hardly anybody in the state of Georgia could imagine that integration of the schools would take place, the county unit system would be overthrown,
It was
the University of Georgia would be desegregated.
Right. Again, off the record, it was fortunate that the University of Georgia was chosen to be the place to start integration, because every family in Georgia has got some tie to the University of Georgia.
That's right. If it had been Georgia State or Georgia Tech, it would have been a very different kind.
If it had been Tech, it would have been a lot harder. The people of Georgia couldn't conceive of the University of Georgia being closed.
Well, it kind of is like the episode with Gene Talmadge and the Board of Regents, and Ellis running and winning, to a great degree, capitalizing on that because it did touch so many people around.
When you talk to your history class, I'll tell you, I talked to Herman Talmadge about this not long ago. A mutual friend of ours, came by, Bill Lanier from Meadow, Georgia, and he wanted to discuss the situation that occurred between Roy Harris. Roy edited a little paper. Have you seen that?
Sure.
That smear sheet that he wrote.
Yeah.
Had to deal with that. Anyway, Roy and Ellis quoted the Accreditation Commission for a couple of years after this thing happened, when Cocking was fired.
Right, sure.
And they asked them to take the University of Georgia off the accredited list.
Right.
So it would make
a campaign issue.
Make a campaign issue, and that was the issue.
And that was before Roy switched over. in
At that
46,
time,
right?
he and Ellis were very close.
And he gave
He
Gene fits in the.
But Roy told me this. He had a few drinks, and he told me, he said, we had that accreditation commission right under our finger. And said they did exactly what we asked them to do. And they made the issue, and we won the race on that basis. But Roy wanted to be governor too.
Right,
And Ellis wanted to be. He tried to change the Constitution so he could run.
succeed himself, and
so he could succeed himself, and he and Roy broke up over that.
and Ellis lost that one by a couple votes, I think, on the
It's
succession.
very close.
And
very close. One of the few things that he didn't get past during his.
just out of curiosity, because this has sort of always been interested, why did Rivers enter that race? Ed Rivers. What was behind that in 46? Because there's Carmichael and Gene.
I don't know. Rivers, of course, at that time was very much discredited because he and
Because of the highway department.
The highway department, John Greer, Hiram Evans, the Key Klux Klan, they was all tied in with that. I guess it's just because politicians like to run.
Because in that 40,
I don't like to run unless I think I've got a chance of getting elected. But
because the Rivers candidacy changed the whole county unit situation in that race, as well as the popular vote. But I mean, the county unit situation, and if he hadn't run, would Carmichael have had a chance against Gene Talmadge? Carmichael won the popular vote.
He would have beaten him if it hadn't had the county unit system.
So I've always been intrigued by the Rivers candidacy, whether somebody put him up to run or
Maybe so. I don't know. I wouldn't. I remember the campaign, but I wasn't on the inside enough to know what was going on.
Back to the event that we're talking about. Did you all, when you and Bobby Russell and George Stewart met at the governor's mansion that morning, did you talk about approaches to take with Judge Mitchell, with Oscar Mitchell?
No. We knew they were very close friendship, and we sent George out there to see if something could be done. We didn't talk about the approach. He knew more about how to approach Oscar Mitchell than Bobby did or I did.
And then he reported back and said,
"Well, he reported back and told us
it's done." Yeah. But what did he say? He
said I talked to him and it was successful. I said, "Okay, I'll call Bobby Kennedy," and I did call him. I guess at the headquarters. I don't know where he was.
And you told Bobby to call Judge Mitchell? Just to touch base or to say anything in particular?
I told him to call him, and I thought it would be a successful call.
And how did that idea come up that that it would be important for Bobby to call Judge Mitchell?
I think he wanted some word from the candidate, directly from the headquarters, that they were interested in this thing, that he would benefit from it. Like I told you, maybe Jim Mackey can give you more information than I can, but I do know that Oscar and George went to Washington and talked about the candidate after the election.
Oh, Judge Mitchell's even quoted in here saying something like,
I think he probably thought he might be appointed federal judge. I'm
right.
just guessing. And I don't know what George told him.
So that's a possibility.
That's a possibility.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I better get to Judge Mitchell and talk with him.
If you can, that would be the thing to do.
But I don't think he's really, and of course, for good and sufficient reasons, he would be reluctant to talk about that conversation because he reversed himself.
Yeah.
He had made a stand and changed his stand.
Maybe if you're close enough to Jim Mackey, maybe he could work it out for you.
I accept your, Mackey likes what we do at Georgia State.
Jim Mackey and I have been close friends. He was in the legislature while
I'm aware, yeah.
And we were always on different sides, but we remained close friends.
Well, he's a man of integrity.
Yeah.
Let me just see if there's anything else that I have on here. There's no press conferences that you can recall that you had, or public statements that you made in the week before King gets shifted over to DeKalb County, in the days before you get this call from President Kennedy?
No, I wouldn't have made any statement.
Because I saw references about, was there any contact you had with the Kennedy campaign in those days before you got the call from President Kennedy, in that week before?
No, I don't remember any contact that we had before the phone call.
In your capacity either as governor of Georgia or involved in the Kennedy campaign? I mean, or did the Georgia campaign?
We had not discussed the Martin Luther King thing until he called me.
And then
I want to talk about my wife. She listened to the conversation with President Kennedy.
I might, yeah. And was there any contact outside of President Kennedy's call to you and your call to Robert Kennedy later that afternoon? What, if any, was there any other contact that right in those days around this episode went on between you or the Georgia campaign people and the national campaign people?
I didn't discuss it with George Smith or Griffin Bell. I didn't want anybody. I wanted to keep it between George Stewart and Bob Russell and me, because I thought maybe I'd run for governor again, or maybe for the Senate.
Griffin corroborates this in the interview I did with him, and he said I was kind of caught by surprise by this whole thing, and a couple of days later he says Bobby Kennedy calls up and how are things in Georgia, and he said, and Griffin says, well, we might survive, and he said, well, they're going to go well in the rest of the country, or and of course they went well in Georgia for the Kennedys too.
Yeah, President Kennedy called me on either the day before or the day of the election and gave me his phone number to call him, to give him the results of the campaign. As soon as we knew what the results were. So I called him at Hyannisport and told him that Georgia was in his column, not to worry.
Right. Well,
started worrying about other states.
It was one of the widest margins of any state in the country.
It was. I told him it was overwhelming.
Let me think. Did Jack know about Bobby's call to the judge?
Oh yeah. Yeah, that was arranged. Jack and Bobby were discussing this thing, and he told me to call Bobby and give Bobby the results of what happened.
Right, because some of the accounts of this event have sort of implied that the two brothers did their phone calls independently of each other, but it doesn't.
Not in this case. They might have in other cases, but.
Did Judge Mitchell prepare his own statement?
I don't know. I don't know how his statement was prepared.
Okay, and so there wasn't anybody in the campaign who prepared that statement.
It had nothing to do with it.
So the feeling was to get George Stewart to talk with the judge, back off, and let things unfold, and be pretty far removed.
Stay away from it as far as we could, because it would have been political suicide for me to be involved in getting him out of jail at that time.
Right.
After I did talk about it, I had a lot of my friends said, told me we should let him stay in jail. But I did after 72.
I mean, did you consider other options? I mean, was that on the table? You could have let him stay in jail and.
Well, of course, yes, but I told President Kennedy I'd do what I could. I didn't promise him we would be successful, but I told him we'd do what we could, and it was successful because of the chain of events.
Right. And of course, this is all with the background that you had gotten this assurance before from Senator Kennedy that he wouldn't interfere in the sovereign affairs of.
That's right. Before I announced my support,
so
he and I talked privately, away from
right,
the rest of the group.
Right, now, so
I
that...
said, I have something that I want to ask you not to do if I support you, and that is not to send federal troops into Georgia or to federalize our National Guard. And he told me that he would not under any circumstances. I said, we'll handle it ourselves some way.
Did that earlier conversation in any way kind of inform this early in the morning conversation with you and the Kennedys and Senator Kennedy and what you decided to do?
Oh, we were, Senator Kennedy called me several times during the campaign, but not about this matter.
Right. I'm just saying that you had a relationship with him. And
Oh yes, in fact I've got a picture.
And you didn't get any commitment from him during that phone call not to publicly talk about the case or make some strong...
He understood that. He knew what the situation was in Georgia. He and Bobby both knew.
Okay. So you didn't even have to say, you know, I'll see what I can do, but please no.
I told Bobby to certainly not to tie me in any way.
Right, right.
But he knew that anyway.
I had been wondering, you know, I guess it was Judge Mitchell, or who made the decision to actually transport King for that brief period of time to Reidsville.
I don't know about that. I have no knowledge of that.
Was there any communication between the governor's office or the Georgia campaign office and Mayor Hartsfield during it?
No.
Any of this time?
Not about that.
No.
Or anything else at that
No
time.
telling Hartsfield to get out of it.
No.
Or, you know.
Oh, that would have tied us into it if we'd done that.
Now, I saw that there was some, I think this is actually the previous week when King is still in Atlanta and not in DeKalb County, and they're negotiating what to do about the Riches situation, the lunch counter situation. I thought that I saw something, I may be wrong, where you had announced that you had talked with Kennedy and he had no authority or intention or desire to intervene in Georgia's business. Now that may be a reference to your previous conversation.
That was a reference to our conversation.
Okay. And did you release any statement in support of Judge Mitchell's original decision to keep King in jail?
No. I stay away from it.
Okay. I mean, this is before, I'm talking about before Senator Kennedy's call to you.
No.
Okay. I noticed in this article from Charlie Pugh that one of the things that Stewart did, apparently they were right at the end of the period that they had to appeal. That it was just about the 30 days for appeal was just about over, and he, you know, according to this article, said to Judge Mitchell, well, one of the days was a holiday, so they can file a motion to appeal. Are you aware of any of the legal... George Stewart was an attorney, too, wasn't
he was
he?
an attorney.
It seems from this Charlie Pugh article that he may have used some of the legal arguments as well as sort of the political arguments.
I don't know what arguments he used.
Okay.
In fact, just from what happened later, I figured he probably told me he'd have a good chance to be a federal judge.
Uh-huh.
But certainly I made no promises to Mitchell. Had no contact with him personally.
Okay.
Except through George.
Anything else that you'd like to recount about the episode? And about the treatment of the episode and how it's been recorded in history and
No, I've seen several different accounts of it, but I know what happened. I know how it happened. And I think President Kennedy has made the statement that success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. I think the fact that he was released and that made a difference in the campaign, a lot of people wanted to claim credit for it. I didn't at that time. I didn't want to be involved in any way.
Right. Ironically, the person who sets things in motion that lead to King's release and Bobby's phone call and so forth.
I didn't want that to be public knowledge at all.
I think Mayor Hartsfield jumps right on this Charlie Puth story and says, no, it wasn't George Stewart. I'm the man. And so as early as December of 1960, there's
Bill Hartsfield and Oscar Mitchell probably never spoke in their lives. They were completely different people.
Right.
Politically, they were just like that.
I think Hartsfield's point was that he brought the attention of the King matter to the Kennedy folks, to the Kennedy campaign.
Maybe he did.
And that really, from his perspective, was although if he had stayed in jail,
it wouldn't have made any difference.
Right.
Now, Harris Wofford, I had no idea who he was or what was going on until this Reader's Digest. I did notice that he got elected to the Senate in a surprise election in
Right.
Pennsylvania.
Right.
But
No, he was in the Kennedy campaign, I think in the civil rights branch of the Kennedy campaign.
which I knew nothing about.
Right. What was George L's response to King's original? Was he involved at all?
I didn't discuss it with George L.
I meant before Judge Mitchell revoked the bill.
I don't know whether he made any statement about it. I don't recall that he did. It would have been wise not to.
And then over the years, you began to mention it after 1972.
After 1972.
Although, as far as I can recall, the first public sort of for posterity statement that you made was the interview with Chuck Piles, back in '87.
Yes, I did talk to.
That was the first time that I saw mentioned. Was there any time that you mentioned it sort of in public before that time?
I think after '72, I talked about it a good bit. I knew then that my political future was gone,
Right.
and I just thought I'd let the thing come out.
Because it's interesting to me that there's kind of two stories. There's the Georgia story, this story, and then there's the national story, which focuses on Bobby's phone call to
Mitchell.
To Mitchell.
Bobby didn't have any leverage with Mitchell except through what George had done.
I don't know what your opinions is, but to some degree, it seems that the historians have gotten caught up in the Kennedy mystique.
Yeah.
Because they use things like, amazingly, Judge Mitchell was expecting that call.
Oh yes, he was expecting it.
He wouldn't have it.
Either from Bobby or from
Senator.
President, Senator then.
Oh.
Kennedy.
Did you ever talk with Judge Mitchell about it?
I never mentioned it to him. In fact, I don't know whether I've even seen him since then.
Okay. Well, I think.
But I think if Jim Mackey is that close to Judge Mitchell, he might get an interview with him, and he will tell you that George, he'll relate if he tells the truth.
Ironically,
I don't think he'd have any reason now not to. He's already out of office and through practicing law, probably.
who? Mackey?
No, Mitchell.
Mitchell, I think, is quite a bit older than
Yeah.
that. But now Mackey actually, ironically, was called by Martin Luther King Sr. after the driver's license charge because he was in DeKalb County, and I think he checked with Jack Smith, who was the judge, what would in the court, what would happen with the traffic with his driver's license thing, and did some minor things because he was a DeKalb County based lawyer.
And a liberal.
And a liberal,
very
right.
liberal. He was in close contact with it.
Right, absolutely.
The black community.
And then an issue that evolves is that the probation period for King is much longer. They slap him with a much heavier probation for the expired driver's license than somebody else might have received. Were you in any way sort of aware of
No,
that?
I was not.
Why do you think sort of the people who've written about this have focused so much on Bobby Kennedy and not kind of raised the question as to why you know, how improbable that was that a phone call from Bobby Kennedy would have swung the day alone, by itself alone. I'd be kind of curious to know what your opinions are of that.
I really don't know how they arrived at their conclusions. It was improbable that Bobby Kennedy could have called. At that time, he was not well known. He was just a brother of the Kennedy.
Young kid.
I don't think that. I know that just a phone call to him probably would have upset the judge unless he was looking for something. He thought he'd get something out of it, I'm sure.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Governor.
Let me let you talk to my wife.
To me is how long nobody ever even thought about it or looked into it or what, it just happened, and of course that was what that's what everybody wanted at the time, was just to get him out and low key and try to calm the waters, I guess.
Sure. What do you recall about when then Senator Kennedy, Jack Kennedy, called up to the governor's mansion
and told him, he was senator, he was running hard. And he basically just told him that Martin Luther King was in jail, and that, I think it was a matter of, I don't know, I had the feeling that it's, Georgia's going to be a mess, and it could very well have turned into just a horrible mess. Had he stayed in jail, it caused enough trouble, really, getting him out. I mean, so you don't know what would have happened if he'd had to stay in. But as well as I remember, actually, it was just a phone call, and then Ernie made a couple of phone calls. I guess I guess he's George Stewart and Bob Russell, and then
your brother.
My brother, yeah.
Right.
Well, see, that's a funny relationship. Not funny, but Ernie and Bob were so close, and Bob was just a very individual character, really, and. So was George Stewart, as a matter of, and anyway, Bob had a real fast, quick mind, and of course his first thought, I guess, was who could get him out, if Ernie really wanted to get him out, who could get him out, and then old George Stewart was probably the first person they thought of, and George knew Judge Mitchell, and it turned out that that's just kind of the chain of events, and of course it was so close to the election. I think it probably if it happened a couple of months before, it wouldn't have made the same difference. But it was really down to the last couple of days. And
I'd be curious to know about your brother and then also George Stewart, what kind of people they were in terms of, being political thinkers and being able to think on the spot.
I don't know much about George Stewart. I cannot tell you much about George Stewart and the way he thought, or how fast he thought. But I know Bob was one of the fastest thinking people in the world. You may know that Hal Henderson is writing a book on Ernie, and other day he was talking to me, and I told him that it's real funny how Bob and Ernie, it's not like opposites attract as far as they're concerned, but Bob was an impulsive, quick, let's do it this way, and then 5 minutes later he'd change his mind and say, no, this is the way to do it. No, we can't do it because of this, we got to do, Ernie is slow and deliberate and thinks about it so methodically. He reminds me of my daddy.
Mm-hmm.
Now where Bob got this quickness is just something else, because Bob really was one of the quickest people, and usually so right, his first impulse, but he could think about it, and then when Ernie came up with the slow, methodical things,
deliberate.
Then they could hit a middle, or they could talk each other into each by proving their points.
Right.
But they really had a relationship, and I've heard Ernie say several times that Bob was as close to his brother that he ever had. He did have a half brother, but he was 16 years older, and he was not at home.
Do you remember this particular episode? I mean,
do I remember?
Yeah.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
It's funny because I remember Ernest sitting over there in that chair in the den, talking on the telephone to the senator, and then
and saying what?
See,
I mean, it's 6:30 in the morning.
You've seen my grandchild today. It probably was probably my children, then probably getting them off to Spring Street. We got up early and had breakfast and got them off. I really don't remember what he said, but then when it was over, he told me what had happened and what was going on, and that's really. I don't think I put that. I don't know that I did. I don't guess I put that much importance to it.
Well,
at the time,
the
you know, 'cause
importance comes out afterwards.
It does, and so it was just another phone call. We got lots of phone calls from different people for different things at odd hours, and so I don't really think it made that much of an impression on me, really.
But you remember him calling Bob
Um,
after talking with Senator Kennedy?
yeah, I do now. I don't remember him talking to George, and I don't. And I know, I mean, I don't know that he talked to Judge Mitchell. I'm not even sure. I don't think he did. I don't know that he did. I don't remember that
Right.
really. I just remember Bob was just the closest advisor Ernie had throughout the, during
For
his
years,
whole
right,
career.
yeah.
Bob was his closest advisor. And then Bob died in '65. So, I mean, Bob was there for the whole 10 years, 14 years.
Right.
That Ernie was active, you know.
At the state level,
Mhm.
right.
And so therefore that would have been the natural thing to do, is to call your advisors. Because it was a mighty big thing, because the Republicans were gaining ground, and it was a Democratic administration of Ernie's, and it was
Right.
important for him because he'd gone out on a limb for Senator Kennedy in Georgia. And so I guess it was very important. It's like I say, I don't retain a whole lot of things, and I was probably busy getting children off to school in between phone calls and so forth. So I really don't. It did make a real big impression on me.
Right. I would say, we were talking before about what a tightrope he had to walk.
On so many things.
being
I mean, he
governor at
really
that-
had the hard the time.
Everything came on his watch. and,
It really did, and he had it seemed like there were an awful lot of tightropes going on at the time.
Well, the university, the Sibley Commission, the county unit
the
system.
county unit, and and then King, and then the Democratic convention that year was a interesting one. And anyway, he had a real. It wasn't dull. I'll put it that way. It was not just
Right.
a mundane
Administration, right.
There was a
Right.
lot going on all the time.
Oh, I'd be curious. I mean, obviously, for good and sufficient reasons, he kept his own role in all of this sort of out of the public eye. I'd be curious as to when this got talked about.
Well, actually, now see, that's not a good one for me to do either. It isn't for me to talk about, because I remember some book came out and alluded to it, and I can't tell you which book.
There's
And then
a
a magazine came out.
Have a bunch.
Well, you have that, but I remember when it first came out, and it was just okay by the door. It really was not supposed to be. Then after it got to be, after Kennedy was gone, and it didn't matter, and probably King was gone by then, was he? Well, both of them I don't remember, because some book alluded to it, I remember, but couldn't prove it, or didn't have any proof. They just thought that it had taken a phone call to the governor's office in some way, and probably somebody in the White House remembered it and told somebody. But you don't know how
Robert
those.
Kennedy was interviewed in '64 for the Kennedy Library, and he makes
I think
allusion
that
to
was it. That may have been it.
And then the other people then have tried to make sense of this without ever interviewing Governor Vandiver. And of course by that time Bobby Kennedy died shortly after that, and so he was, and then George Stewart died, and
and then Judge Mitchell's dead, isn't he?
I think he is still alive.
I don't know.
He was alive a few years ago, and I need to check
know.
it.
I really don't know.
For obvious reasons, didn't want to talk about it over the years too.
No, see, he wouldn't. I mean,
He's a
it's
judge.
one of those things that you just don't talk about. You just did, and then you did what you thought was what ought to be done at the time, I guess, is the way to put that.
And in a very pressured situation with not very much time. And
No, just a really very little time. And then DeKalb County, Judge Mitchell was from DeKalb County. DeKalb County was was the focal point at that moment, and that's a bad place to be when you've got, I mean, with that situation. I'm sure he was trying to think what would be best for DeKalb County. You know, get him out of DeKalb County, let him go somewhere else. You know, because he was such an issue. Oh, he was such a.
And it was making the national.
Yeah, it would, and it was he was getting bigger and bigger, and this certainly didn't hurt Martin Luther King to be, you know, put in jail in DeKalb County for something.
Right.
And because Georgia, well, all the southern states, and
Sure.
people still think, and you know, I'm sure that he was trying to do what was best for DeKalb County. Maybe that was his first thought. Maybe his second thought was Kennedy himself, or maybe.
Maybe it's
You
just
know,
angry at Martin
there's no
Luther
way
King,
to
right?
know.
Yeah.
Mm-mm.
Right.
But with the atmosphere, the political air in Georgia at that time, I'm sure he was glad to get him out of DeKalb County.
To Reidsville.
And you know, just because of he didn't want the notoriety. Just think about the changes that have taken place
Extraordinary.
in the 30 years that have gone by, and the political air and the atmosphere and everything's changed.
It's impossible for, say, my students to understand.
They can't understand the Korean War, much
Right.
less. I mean,
Right.
that's back there a long time.
Right. They can't. They've grown up in a different world. It's ancient
Completely.
history, and it's as remote as Oglethorpe. I mean,
Well, it really is, and it bothers me. You know, I don't know how much but the funny thing I've always told my children is that I did not know much about World War I, because the history teachers never got to the last chapter. The year was over, and we
Right.
still had the last chapter, and so therefore I don't know as much about World War I as I wish I did. They don't know about World War II, and when I tell them that I had to give a tube of toothpaste to get, empty tube to get a full tube, hey, that's just something they can't imagine. They can't imagine rationing, or people just going off. Like my brother Bob, he was in the Marines. He enlisted in February after Pearl Harbor, and he was 17 years old. Broke my mother and daddy's hearts. They thought he should have gotten at least one more year at Emory. He
Right.
was a freshman, and
Right.
they thought if he could have just gotten one more year, and of course they would have given anything to keep him out of it. But anyway,
Sure.
he joined the Marines and he went through the whole Pacific and was wounded. And my children know Uncle Bob was a veteran, and that's all in the world that they know. They don't know the fears
What he
and the
went through,
feelings
right.
that you had for 3 years while he was over
Sure.
there. They cannot. Nobody can understand it unless they were there. And so it's a whole. Everything's changing.
Yeah, this is something I should actually ask Governor Vandiver. I talked with Judge Bell about this. How there was sort of after the war, a group of veterans, lawyers, who kind of began to meet at the bar, including.
Well, they were actually old friends ahead of time, and they had
A
been
lot of
friends.
them at
In
the
fact, this
university.
past weekend we were with one of them who had gone all the way through law school with Ernest. And when we do get together, they are the same people that Ernie went to university with, went through law school with. They are the ones on.
Robert Jordan. And
Yes. Well, did he show you this box?
No.
Well, this. Yeah. Come on. This
Pretty
is.
hard to him up.
This is a box of the people who paid for Ernest, paid his entrance fee in both of his races, lieutenant governor and governor,
I see.
and paid it in '66 because he had to.
Right, because of the heart attack.
Right. But see, it's written with that. Well, he could say in there. I'm not, nothing I'm saying that important. But all of them
Right.
are
Done
University of Georgia graduates except Griffin Bell.
Except Griffin.
And all
Bell
of them went to law
Mercer.
school
Went to
with
Mercer,
Ernie
right.
and went to, I'm sure all of them are, but I said that. And
I think that's probably true.
I don't think he was in law school, but these were all people he went to University of Georgia with,
Right.
or law school, one or the other,
Except for Griffin Bell.
except for
He
Griffin
went to
Bell.
Mercer.
And he went to Mercer.
Right.
And, all of, and they still are, our best friends are still the same people
That's
that he went to
interesting.
school
I
with.
mean, I've been kind of thinking that, and then they were all veterans, and so after the war, kind of hit the ground really running,
Everybody had run, well, they had a lot of catching up to do.
and had families, and
Yeah, and you think about Ernie and I didn't marry before 7. We were one of the few that married either, well, after the war, because most of them married during the war, or some of them were married, this boy we were with,
Griffin
Bill
Bell.
Jennings, they married before the war,
Right.
because we used to kid them, they had children just before any of us had gotten married, and it was, their household was like this household is this moment.
But I had the feeling, again, and I've interviewed Griffin Bell, that the war, of course, opened your eyes to a bigger world. You know, Griffin Bell was 23 or 4 years old and was doing things.
Well, I will not wax about that much.
Right.
But my whole theory on all this change is the war, and they sent Southerners to the north and north to the south and east and west all mixed, and they found things they liked in another part of the country or that they didn't like in another part. A lot of them found wives and brought them back,
Right.
and a lot of the girls found boys that were here in Georgia stationed at acid bases and so forth, and they brought in their ideas, and then just the whole world changed
Oh, that's
after World War II.